Hello, I'm AJ Camacho with WRGW's PINDROP. I'm speaking now with Christina Fink. She is a professor of international affairs at the George Washington University, who specializes, among other areas, in Myanmar, which is, of course, today's subject. Professor Fink, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
I'd like to I'd like to start on your assessment of the environment in Myanmar prior to the coup in 2021. We did speak with Ambassador Marcial on this. He told us that he could have seen it within reason, but he really didn't think it would happen at the time that he left his post in 2021. How did this coup come about? The military government had a lot of power before they chose to go undertake this coup against the democratic government in Aung San Suu Kyi. How did this come about?
Yeah, I think what's important to understand is that even though the military had a lot of power, they were used to having full power for decades. And so they had engineered this experiment in 2011 where power would be shared between the military and a civilian government. But their expectation was that the military party would be able to win those civilian elections. So it would be military people who'd taken off their uniforms and were now part of a political party working together with military who were still in uniform. But that didn't work out the way that they had planned. So the first 5 years, it was like that because the Democratic parties refused to participate in the first election because it wasn't going to be free and fair. But the 2015 election was free and fair. And so the National League for Democracy, led by Nobel Prize winner Aung San Suu Kyi, won a landslide victory. And so the military found it very difficult to work with her and her government because they did try to reduce some of the power that the military had. In other cases, they decided to back off. They knew it was risky. But when they won a second election in 2020 and won an even larger share of the vote, well over 80% of the vote, I think the military leadership was very concerned about where things were going to go and if the NLD and the public would feel that they were in a stronger position to try to reduce military prerogatives even further. And for that reason, well, I think that's one of the reasons why the military leadership staged the coup.
I want to turn now to a very recent development on this, a small development, is this international parliamentary inquiry that was released very recently. It was written by 8 international legislators, including the United States' Representative Ilhan Omar. Here was their conclusion, among other things, that, quote, coordinated sanctions and arm embargoes and recognizing the national unity government as the legitimate authority in Myanmar are all recommendations that they have and could be the deciding factor in whether the future of Myanmar is authoritarian or more democratic. What do you personally make of that assessment? Of course, to an extent, sanctions have been imposed, arms embargoes have been imposed to an extent. What do you make of this recommendation? And is there a particular reason why the extent to which these policies have been used so far have seemingly not been too effective, or maybe they've been more effective than we think?
I think that those policies are a good start, but some of the aspects of those policies need to be deepened, and then there are other things that need to be done as well. So in terms of the sanctions have primarily focused on individuals in the military and connected to the military, and some of their businesses. The sanctions that would have the most impact, but that are risky to implement, are sanctions on banks. So sanctions on banks that are owned by the military or the state, or by people who are cronies of the military, so close colleagues of the military. Those would have a much more dramatic impact, but of course they also run the risk of making life even more difficult for people on the ground. So that's a challenge, how to try to figure out how to target certain banks that might be benefiting primarily a class of people who are connected to the military, but not ordinary people, But the reality is that the currency in Myanmar has really lost value, and people are struggling to make a living. And so it is important not to make things worse for ordinary people in Myanmar. But another thing that's really important is to try to make it easier for people in the military who want to leave the military, leave Myanmar, to be able to do so safely. And the challenge there is that they need to know that there's somewhere safe that they can go, because if they were caught by the military, they would face certainly imprisonment and, terrible impacts for their families as well. So being able to enable military officers and their families who want to leave to be able to do so and have somewhere safe to go. The recommendation to strengthen the national unity government, which is basically the elected government that was overthrown by the coup and other parties, is really important as well. Right now, they are able to operate in certain parts of the country, but that's relatively limited. They have the broad support of the public, but enabling them to be able to do more will be important to turning this around.
I should say, on the note of giving people an avenue out, I myself, 2 years ago when the coup happened, I had someone in my own class who I was somewhat close with, who had connections to who had family connections to the military in Myanmar. And they said a very similar thing. Like, they know a lot of people in the military who don't like what's happening, but they don't feel that they have a way out.
Exactly.
Turning now towards the intersection of this and the genocide against Rohingya Muslims, ethnic cleansing. I want to start actually by going to Aung San Suu Kyi a little bit, because she faced a lot of criticism between 2016 and 2021 about sort of allowing this to happen. Do you think that this coup shows anything else, like, about what might have been going on behind the scenes? Was there some stuff that the international community might not have understood about what was guiding her?
I think what was guiding her is the fact that most people in Myanmar supported the military's actions against the Rohingya people at that time. Buddhist nationalism was very strong in the country. It was being promoted by the military, by a certain group of Buddhist ultra-nationalist monks, and ordinary people who felt that the country faced an existential threat from Muslims, and particularly from the Rohingya Muslim population. And people were so emotional about it. I mean, if you tried to discuss it rationally, people felt like you didn't understand that this was something that affected their security personally, the security of the country as a whole, the survival of Buddhism as a religion. I mean, people really had gotten worked up about it. And so to try to go against that tide was politically risky for Aung San Suu Kyi. And so one could argue, and I think there's every reason to argue this, that she should have taken the high road. But the reality was there could have been a political price to pay for that. And she chose to kind of try to tack a middle course that really did not satisfy anybody who cared about the Rohingya people or the Rohingya people themselves.
I want to jump on that, actually. You mentioned this fear, really, of Rohingya Muslims, the fact that this was a security concern. It was very crucial. There were, of course, some armed Rohingya groups. You wrote in 2019 for Asia survey that Facebook has had a tremendous influence on that perception. There's a lot of talk about misinformation and disinformation in these United States. Please tell us, when you say it was tremendously impactful, how impactful was that? Help us understand exactly what it was that Facebook was used for and what the response from Facebook executives were.
Yeah, well, first I want to say that despite the fact that people had this fear, it was not a realistic fear. The Rohingya were not about to take over the country. There are, hundreds of thousands of Muslims who have lived in central Myanmar as well, peacefully, and have had friendships and marriages and everything else with Buddhists in the country. So this was a completely manufactured fear. Facebook played an incredible role for a couple of reasons. One, because most people only had access to the internet through their phones, and their phones came bundled with Facebook. So for most people, it was free. And so that meant that it was the only way that they accessed the web. Their access to the internet was Facebook. And there were certain social influencers who were able to use that platform in Myanmar very effectively to reach a lot of people. And there were human rights groups in Myanmar who were monitoring this and who were alerting Facebook to the hate speech that was being posted and how that was potentially leading, or in some cases proven to have led to the incitement of violence. And Facebook was very slow to react. Facebook did not have enough people working for them who could actually monitor what was going on. And even when they got the reports, they tended to act far too slowly. And so for some people, they feel that because of that, Facebook is really complicit in some of the violence that happened against Rohingya and Muslims more generally.
Interesting how this problem is not exclusive to the United States. For sure, American news can be very centered on the United States. And this is one of those issues. What we're seeing right now, the coup, the fact that the genocide is still ongoing, doesn't make the headlines as much anymore. I want to conclude on this. If you have any thoughts on this, where do things go from here? The genocide is ongoing. There's still a military regime on, but there's still also fierce resistance to that military regime. Obviously, predicting the future is nearly impossible, but what do you see as being crucial matters here? Is the international community going to be a big part? Is it going to mostly be decided domestically? What are your takes?
It's going to be a combination of international support and domestic continued resistance. And the hopeful signs are the fact that in Southeast Asia, we see many of the governments in the region are really fed up with the Myanmar military. They kind of gave the regime a chance and said, here are some things we'd like you to do, which were some pretty simple demands. The regime has not honored those. And so even countries that before were loath to criticize the regime have now come out and said, look, the regime is responsible for what's happening here, for the total collapse of Myanmar, and we're going to call a spade a spade. I think China as well, although they are engaging with the regime, they're not happy with the regime. So there is room for the international actors in the region and players like the United States and others to come together and really to be able to support the movement against the regime more effectively so that change can happen.
Indeed, that was one of the big conclusions of the parliamentary inquiry we discussed, especially China. They're going to prove a big role. Thank you very much, Professor.
Can I say one more thing?
Oh yeah, of course.
No, you're gonna have to say your last line again, but I just wanted to say that for people in Myanmar and for the Rohingya as well, they feel that with the crisis in Ukraine, attention has shifted away from their struggle. And for them, they really want people to remember that their struggle is still going on, and please not forget them.
So much news, so little time. And we do have to question ourselves sometimes as to, are we covering the right things? I'll be honest, but like 2 weeks ago, it was never nowhere in my mind that the genocide was still going on, that this military coup was still going on. And it is worth talking about. Thank you very much, Professor Christina Fink, Professor of International Affairs at George Washington University with specialization interests in Myanmar. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.